Awesome. Well, folks, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Thomas. He's going to be talking to us today about processing cloud events with Spring and Knative. Take it away, Thomas.
All right. Hope you can see my screen.
It looks great, boss.
So yes, so hello all the Spring enthusiasts. I'm happy to see you here in the beginning of Spring 2020. So that kind of rang a bell for me because, well, let me just introduce myself. My name is Thomas Risberg. I've been a member of the Spring team since 2003 and mostly worked on the JDBC support early on. And I helped write an early book on Spring Framework with Rod and Jürgen and the rest of the gang. And that was back in 2005. But what did ring a bell was that Spring Framework 1.0, the first GA release, was actually released 16 years ago. We were aiming for the equinox, but we kind of missed it by a couple of days. So the March 24th, 2004 is when we actually released the first release of Spring. So it's great to see Spring keep going. A lot of things have changed. There are lots of new releases, lots of new projects have been added. You see a lot of like Spring Security, Spring Integration came in, and then lots of other Spring Data, Spring Boot. And one nice thing is to see that the community has been growing and sticking with Spring. It's really nice to see. We really need the community to give us feedback and ideas and suggestions. So thank you for everybody continuing to use Spring. So let me start talking a little bit of the things I'm going to be using in my demo. We need, if you look back at Spring, like initially everything was running on like web servers, like WebLogic and WebSphere and Tomcat. But now the world is kind of changing and we have the Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry to run our apps on. So things change a little bit, how we deploy them, how we build them. And Kubernetes is great for infrastructure. It's not that great for developers. It's not that easy to work with. So there's a Knative project that was started by Google, and we have been helping them develop that. And it's now a pretty healthy community around the Knative project. And it's basically helps you make it easier to get your apps running on Kubernetes, and also provides serverless features where if your app is not getting any requests, it can get scaled down to 0. And it also has a eventing feature where it will feed events to your application when they come in, and your application can subscribe to specific types of events that it wants to react to. So I started looking at that. I thought maybe we'll just write a simple little Spring Boot app to process these events. So what happens is the events come in, there's a broker that feeds these events, and then your app can say, okay, I want this type of event. It can specify a trigger. And this events I'm working on with this app that I'm going to be demoing is, I call them Spring events. And once they trigger, realizes, okay, this is a type of Spring event I should be sending, tell the broker to send it over to my application that I'm running, or a function. And the application I'm writing is going to run as a Knative service. And basically it's a much simpler configuration style here than you would have to do normally if you use deployments and services in the standard Kubernetes style. So here I'm pretty much just specifying the image that I'm going to be deploying. and the namespace and the name of the service that I want to create. And then Knative takes care of configuring everything. And each configuration, every time I change something for my application, it will create a new revision. So revisions are immutable, while a configuration can change over time. And it typically routes traffic to the most recent revision, but you can specify if you want to send some traffic to the old revision and a little bit of traffic to the new revision, then you can specify that as well. So it kind of gives you a little bit of the blue-green deployment. And the events we're dealing with here in the Knative eventing is Cloud Events, which is a new specification for describing event data. And it's intended to be work across vendors and different projects. So it's helps you have consistent declarations for all these events, and also developer kits in different languages. So there's a Java SDK, there's a Go, there's JavaScript and other languages. So, and it also makes it easier to port your apps from one vendor to another, as long as you, since the data now has a standard definition. So I set up a cloud event type to use for this demo. I'm calling it Spring Event, and it has a couple of properties. There's a version and a release name, so that will be Spring Framework, and version will be 1.0, and the date of the release. And then once I put that on to the broker will then look at the trigger and say, oh, this app wants this type of event, so I'll send it over there. And my application I'm running is based on Spring Cloud Function, which makes it very easy to write very little code and still get a full-blown app that can respond to events like these. So basically, Spring Cloud Function looks into the application context and finds something that implements function. That's a Java util function. And then any bean that does that, it will put into a function registry, and based on the types that it gets called with, it will find the right function to send your message to. And we'll see more in detail once we get into the code part. And to get everything wrapped up into a container image, I use Cloud Native build packs. It makes it very easy to build your apps without having to even specify a Docker file or anything. You just need to have the pack CLI installed on your machine, and I do a local build and it pushes it to my registry. And just looking forward a little bit, there's a Knative functions proposal for a working group. They are going to look into standardized ways of creating the type of functions that can handle these events. And it's still in the early stages, so if you want to follow what's going on there, there's a Knative users group you can join and look for the messages there that pertain to the Knative functions working group. And another project I've been working on is Project Riff, which is an open source platform for building and running functions and applications as well, and containers on Kubernetes and Knative serving. And it has its own build pack where you don't even need to provide a whole application. All you need is just a Java class that implements Java util functions function, and it will pull that in and wrap it in a web app that can serve up the events or any messages coming into your application, or to your function actually. So what's involved in getting our first CloudEvents app running? I just saw a tweet the other day that I thought it was pretty interesting. Like, this guy claims that there are so many discussions about having an easier developer experience on Kubernetes, but a lot of them are not focused on the developer. It's more focused on the infrastructure. So he thought it was time to get something that really focuses in on the developer, which I kind of agree with. But now let's get some code going. And all this is covered in a step-by-step guide. It's on my GitHub account. So if you go to GitHub and look for T. Risberg, there all the slides and the doc for step-by-step is covered in there. So here's that step-by-step guide. So what do we need to get this application or the function running? Well, first of all, we need a Kubernetes cluster and the kube controls CLI. And there's some comments on what types of clusters you can run this with. Right now I'm using a Google GKE cluster, but I also tested this with a bunch of other local clusters and it works pretty well. And you need the curl command, and you also need the Java JDK. I'm using Java 11. And then a couple of other tools. You need the Scaffold, which is a tool that makes it a lot easier to develop code and deploy it to Kubernetes. And it basically watches your code, or you can use it to watch your code. And as you make changes, it will build and deploy it behind the scenes. It's very convenient. You also need Docker installed, and you need the pack CLI from the Cloud-Native Build Packs project. Once you have all that installed, you should be able to go through this guide and get everything up and running, and it shouldn't take too long. And I have instructions for what you need to do. This is, instead of going to Spring Initializer, which is very useful and easy, but it's not so easy to write instructions for doing that, so I'm just using the curl support there. So I just specify all my dependencies here and names and things and create the boot app. So now I should have a boot app. Oops. And we have the Spring application ready to go. So now we just need to fill it out with the rest of the stuff we need. So I'm using the CloudEvents API SDK that I mentioned earlier. So I need to add that to my POM. And I also need a plugin. What I'm doing in the actual cloud event I'm processing is specified as a JSON schema. So I need something to generate the Java class from that schema. So I'm using the JSON schema to Pojo Maven plugin for that. And that should get down here in my build plugins. So now that we have that, we can start working on our actual code. First, I need to add this JSON schema to my code. So I added that in here, source, main, resources, schema. And let's put that schema in there. And to map this, the events that come in on the as cloud events, we need to map that to a domain object, which is the one that's generated from this JSON schema. And we do expect something to be added to Spring Cloud Function to automatically map these things as they come in. Like it already converts a lot of things like JSON to POJOs and other things, but it doesn't know about Cloud Events yet. So I put together a pretty simplistic CloudEventMapper, and that's in a different project. So I just copy that file in here just to have that available. So that's the CloudEventMapper. Now, ideally, this should be handled by Spring Cloud Function automatically. Or worst case, you would have to include some dependency that would handle it. But we're not sure exactly how that's going to get developed yet, but it's coming. And finally, we need to implement our Spring Boot, the function. So let's pull up this Spring Events application. I'm just going to paste in my code here. So here's a function bean that I'm declaring. And you can see it's not happy about the Spring event. It cannot resolve that type because that's the generated class. We haven't generated it yet. Something should probably be able to just compile it. Yeah, still not happy. Maybe we need to package. I forget what target it actually triggers under. Anyway, see, yeah, we saw it kick in the JSON schema to POJO. Maybe it's not refreshing the context. Anyway, our app builds and it looks fine. Maybe this just needs to refresh. So we have everything we need. We should be able to just run this. Once that it's up and running, we should be able to post a cloud event So here I'm just posting at the local host where the app is running right now. I specify the spec version for the cloud events. I specify the Spring event, the type of the cloud event, and I also need an ID. And the other ones are not necessary, but I just put something there. I think the content type actually need the application JSON. And here's my data that I'm passing in as part of the event. This should match that JSON schema that we provided earlier. And yep, so this is the reply we got. It just processed it. I haven't implemented a lot of processing into this. I basically just convert the cloud event to coming in and reply, but this is what I processed. So we actually see some results coming back. I could here create another cloud event and return that, and that way the Knative eventing would pick that cloud event up, and depending on the type, could send it to some other app to continue processing. And typically for for these for the events. I mean, right now I'm just passing the event right to my app. At some point, you could have a source that would pull this event from from other systems and post them onto the broker. Right now, we just directly going to be posting to the app, or later on, we're going to post to the broker. So we don't have an actual source application that's pulling this data, but that's very common. There's some sample brokers or sample sources that are part of the Knative eventing. So now we need to run this on Kubernetes, and to do that, we need a Knative serving. So I have the steps that you need to go through to install that. I have already installed that. I didn't want to do that during the talk, but I need to do a few things just to configure my application. So I need to create the Knative serving service manifest. And then, since I want to use scaffold, which makes everything so much easier, I just initialize this project to use scaffold. So now I can just do a scaffold run. If I want to run my application, I can do scaffold dev if I want to be in development mode, where it watches my source code for any changes and just redeploy things. And there's a build section I'm adding. I'm going to use the Cloud Native build packs. And I'm using the Cloud Foundry CNB Bionic build pack, which contains all the Java and Spring specific. We don't need that now. Build, like Maven and other things you need for the build. And scaffold does manipulate your image. So here I'm just specifying in the Knative service YAML, which is right there. I just specify the image as Spring events, but I can tell scaffold that to use a default repo, which is, I set that to my username. So now scaffold will prefix every image with Risberg / and the name of the image that I specified here. So it will be Risberg / Spring events. So now we can actually run this. And now it decided to download a new version of the build pack, which usually takes a little bit. Every time, since I'm using the latest version. And same thing, when the first time you build this, it will download a lot of Maven resources, but it does a lot of caching. So the second time, it should be a lot faster. Same thing with this, it only downloads whenever there's a new build pack. So this is what you're seeing now, and scrolling by here is basically, it's all Cloud Native build packs using the CNB builder. And it's building the jar, now it's creating the image, pushing that to Docker Hub. And it's almost done. And in order to access, now it's running on Kubernetes. We have a Spring Events Knative service running. And there's a name, this is the URL for it. But to access it, you need to look at you need to access the ingress that is part of the Knative serving install. So I do look up. So that's the IP address for that service. It's actually running in a contour. We're using a contour ingress. So there's a contour ingress. And there's an Envoy load balancer service that we want to access. That's the same IP address, so that's the one we got. So now I can actually curl some data. So instead of doing localhost, we now do the ingress. We just looked up. Everything else is the same. And this takes a little while because once we built the application, once I've been talking here, Knative actually decided to scale this down to 0. And now it has to scale it up again. So we can see this, the pod we just, for this application, just started 18 seconds ago. So, and it will, like a minute, it will disappear again. And then whenever a new request comes in, it gets started up again. We can check the logs. And here we can see, okay, here we processed this message that came in. So the last part I want to show here is using this with Knative eventing. So first we need to install Knative eventing. I already done that. So, but if you run this at home, you have to do that part. We need to label our namespace so Knative eventing knows that we intend to use it, and it actually starts up a broker. We'll check that the broker is up and running, it's ready. Now we can create a trigger that will give us these events and send them to our service that's running. So the service is Spring Events, and the type of events we want to trigger on is the Spring event that we have been working with so far. And let's apply that. Okay, created a trigger. And it's ready, okay. So now we can post some data. To do that, start up a pod inside the cluster that I can use to run curl with. And I just curl a couple events here. So I mean, So we got a couple of events posted. Let's see, we can see the logs. That they actually processed whatever we posted in here. So then I have some cleanup instructions following this. So basically this is a very short, quick tour in getting something up and running and processing cloud events on with Spring Boot and Spring Cloud Functions. And I hope you try this out. Everything is available in my GitHub repo, like I mentioned earlier. The link is here. If you have any problems getting this up and running, you can open an issue in that GitHub repo, and I'll try to follow up and see if we can get things going. And I have links to all the resources that I've been using so far and everything. So thank you for listening, and see if there are any questions.